Ринпоче является вашим учителем? И сразу вы это поняли или прошло время?
So the first question about your first meeting with Chatral Rinpoche, when it happened, and how old you were, and all circumstances. Have you met maybe some another great teachers, Vajrayana teachers before, for example, the Chatral Rinpoche? In short, about this, yeah.
Sure. So in 1977, when I was 19 years old, I had the opportunity from my university to go to Nepal and to undertake an independent research project. And at that time I was studying art. And so I had made an application to study Tibetan scroll painting, Thangka painting, because I thought that would be the way that I could, go to the Himalayan world and to, but my real desire at that time was to connect to Tibetan Buddhism. So that was the circumstances under which I went to Nepal in 1977, in September. And very soon after I arrived, I had an advisor who named Sakya Dorji, who was assigned to me to introduce me to a Thangka painting teacher. And at the same time, I didn't want one in Kathmandu. I wanted to go into the mountains. So he arranged for that. But then I had 1 month in Kathmandu before that. And my great desire then was to connect with a teacher in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition.
Мгм.
Sure. Okay, shall I start again and just give you the basics? Yeah. So because I went from my university to study Tibetan painting techniques, I was assigned to an advisor named Sakya Dorji, and he introduced me to who would become my painting teacher in the Solo Khumbu Everest region of Nepal. But before that, I had 1 month to stay in Kathmandu, and it was during that time that I wanted to connect with a Tibetan Buddhist teacher. I'll let you translate that first.
Мгм.
Should I continue or should I? Okay, yeah. So then he introduced me to, I had met with a couple other Rinpoches first, like Trangu Rinpoche, who of course is a well-known Kagyu monk, teacher, and wonderful teachings from him. That was really my first introduction to living Tibetan Buddhist master. But I was not inspired, to go deeper because I had a very strong inclination to study in the non-monastic tradition. And so when I discussed that with my advisor, Sakya Dorji, he said, okay, I'll introduce you to Dujam Digdro Yeshe Dorji, who was the head of the Nyingma Institute, the Nyingma tradition. And so at that time, Dujam Rinpoche was living in Nepal, in Kathmandu. He had a house in the Tamil area of Kathmandu. So he brought me to see him. And it was just me and my advisor. And Dujam Rinpoche was there sitting at his low bench, just writing and wearing his nakpa, tantric Zen, red and white Zen with his hair pulled back in a top knot. And I was very immediately inspired. I said, okay, this was more appealing to me than the monasteries and the high, what I had encountered there in the first week. So I took refuge at that time, and I said, okay, this is going to be my path. So I still have the paper that Dujam Rinpoche wrote with my Tibetan name, Konchok Wangyal. But then, like 2 days later, my advisor, Sakya Dorji, said, now I will introduce you, now that you're within the system, I can introduce you to my personal teacher. He said, I think you will connect with him very strongly. And I said, fine, that's great. So we went to Swayambhu, which is the major site in Kathmandu where one of the great stupas is located. And Chatral Rinpoche was sitting in the wheelhouse of a prayer wheel, just at the base of the steps that go up to the stupa. And it was just me, Sakya Dorji, and one other, an American woman who also was on the program that I had gone to Nepal on. And she had been studying for a long time in the Zen tradition, as had I, because my background before coming to Nepal, the meditation that I had learned was in the Zen Buddhist tradition. And my reason for that was partly because my major passion at that time in my life as a kind of discipline was rock climbing, mountaineering, ice climbing, and I had discovered that meditation was a way of controlling the mind under extreme conditions. And so I had found that, in a way that my climbing had improved tremendously if I would meditate, in the Zen way before leading a pitch in the vertical world of the rocks. And so immediately after we met with Chatral Rinpoche sitting in the wheelhouse at Swayambhu, Sakya Dorji introduced us as having both been being students of Zen. And so very interestingly, Chatral Rinpoche, he often taught with objects, and he pulled an egg off a shelf that was in this little wheelhouse. We were all sitting cross-legged on the floor. There was a small table between. And he said, Zen is perfect. And he put it on the table between us, but then he spun it. And he said, but it doesn't have handles. So the perfect awareness that, as we know, is whether we call it Dzogchen, Mahamudra, or the state of realization of the nature of the mind through the Chan, Dhyan, Zen tradition, depending on the country in which it manifested, is just the pure, naked awareness of that state. And so at the time I was a little perplexed. I said, why would meditation need handles? But then, I recognized soon after in the conversation that what Chatral had meant was, the skillful means that are so foundational to the Tantric Buddhist path in the Tibetan tradition. So that was all, but wonderful. But meeting him at that time, I knew immediately that this is the teacher that I had looked for. And my impression of him when I walked in, with his wonderful long white beard, was I was meeting Merlin. Merlin, for those who may know, the Arthurian legend traditions, here in the British Isles. Okay. Okay. Sure. I will talk slower. So when I first met Chatral Rinpoche coming in to this prayer wheel house at the base of Swayambhu Stupa, I felt I was looking at Merlin. So Merlin is in the traditions of the Arthurian romances of the Celtic world before Christianity came to the British Isles, was a great magician, a great wizard, a great sorcerer. And Chatral Rinpoche had that presence for me very strongly. And also because I had been introduced from Sakya Dorji that Chatral Rinpoche was someone who avoided monasteries and had mostly practiced in caves and mountains. So that was immediately very, very attractive to me. So therefore, I felt I had found my teacher. But because of the program I was on, I was immediately required to go to the mountains. In this case, the Solukhumbu region of Mount Everest, where I would meet with the Thangka painter, the scroll painter, who would be my teacher for that independent study project that I was doing in Nepal. So I went there and I stayed a month with Kappa Kalden, who was the master painter. And while I was learning all of the methods and techniques of Tibetan scroll painting, where the form of the deity is very specified, it's very exact, but there's more freedom and play with the landscape that surrounds the deity. And so, as my teacher then explained, he said, when I learned the painting, I could be more creative with the mountains. But I was very interested in the symbolism of what I saw in the Thangka paintings that he had done. So I asked about these mountains with waterfalls coming out of holes in the cliff and what it all meant, and these kind of what looked almost like paradisical worlds. So I said, these are all places and the imagination, right? He said, no, not only, because we were very high up in Khumbu, from where his home was near Kumjung, very high altitude. We'd look across at the high Himalayan peaks of Amadablam. And he said, for example, over that ridge, if one could go over that ridge, there's a hidden land, a place called a Beyu, a place there the spiritual and the physical worlds kind of come together. He said, but forget about going. They're very impossible to go to, very dangerous. So of course he didn't know, my background and fascination with high altitude mountaineering and interest. So of course I became extremely interested about the Beyu. So when I got back to Kathmandu and met again with Chatral Rinpoche, I told him, I'd been away for a month in the mountains and had heard about Beyu, and could he tell me about Beyu? What is the hidden lands? Then he just looked at me, because this was really, we'd only met once before that. And then he just looked at me very strongly, I remember, and said, can you spend a month alone? And I said, yes, of course, if there's a reason. And he said, okay, come back when you have 1 month free. I'll send you to a Beyu, to a hidden land. You'll stay there, and then you'll know for yourself what is a Beyu. You won't have to ask me. So that was a very, compelling and challenging statement from him. So of course, there's no way I'm not going to follow up with that. So when I had the opportunity the following year to come back to Nepal and have more than 1 month free, then I arranged to go up in the summer month when he was staying in a Beyu called Yomo Kangri. That means literally the hidden land surrounded by snow mountains. So I arranged to go there and arrived, and I made all the preparations with dried food and other things I would need. And when I got there, he seemed happy that I had come. And then he sent me to a cave that was like a half day's walk above his encampment, which was at a place called Neding. It was about a day's walk from the last village of Takigyang. And he sent me up there with 2 kind of nomad herders who we cleared out a small cave, more like an overhang. There was a lot of sort of grass in it for some reason, and he made on a kata scarf, he wrote this calligraphy. And he said, when you get to the cave, put that on a stick and put it above the cave. That will seal from the outside world, and stay there for a month and then come down and tell me your experience. So I asked him, I said, that's great. But what should I do? What practice should I do when I'm there? And he said, do what you already know. So I wasn't sure what he really meant by that. But then, of course, I realized that he had heard that I had a background in Zen meditation. But at the same time, I wanted more detail. And I asked, so again, kind of pressing him, I said, well, there must be some specific practice I can do that will kind of open the gates to this vision, this dimension of the Beyu, of the hidden land. So in a way that became, as I found out over the years, was very characteristic of him. We were sitting just one-on-one. I could speak at this time not Nepali, not Tibetan, but Nepali language I'd learned. He also knew it fluently. And so we're sitting in his meditation hut, and after I had asked for that, and he said, okay, then he took with his hands some sampa, the roasted barley flour that's mixed with butter tea to make pak, which is a staple of the Tibetan diet, but it can also be made into kind of forms between the hands and molded like clay. So looking at me very kind of intensely with his eyes, he placed this in the table between us, like a torma, I felt, like some kind of a clay offering, but it was made out of tsampa. So I thought, oh, maybe he's going to show me some kind of offering or altar I should set up for the protector spirits. I didn't know. But then he took another one, placed it next to the first one, and then I'm still waiting to see what will happen. Then he took a third one, and he made a triangle out of them. And then he said, when you get to the cave, make sure you set the rocks evenly, like a triangle, so that when you put a pot of water on top, a kettle, it won't spill over and put out the fire. Now go, come back in a month. So this was very typical.
Какой-то сбой.
Yeah. So what I thought he was going to show me was how to make torma, which are the ritual offerings that are made to protector spirits. But it wasn't that at all. So this is often the way he taught, was to kind of trick your mind into thinking one thing and then having a very direct teaching that cut through it. It was a very Zen style. So what he said, once he put these three vertical objects on the table in front between us, he said, when you get to the cave, find three rocks and put them like this in a triangle. Then put the pot of your kettle or your pot of water on top, or tea, so it won't spill, and put out the fire. So it was a way of, I was grasping for, a specific practice, and what he did was to instead teach something extremely practical and important. If you're going to stay alone in a cave, it's important that the fire, the hearth. But it turned out to have, later on, I've discovered, a very kind of more esoteric meaning too. But that I only discussed with him a couple of years later. And that was because it was the last teaching, in a way, he gave before I went off to the cave, and then I stayed actually for an extra week, five weeks before I came down. And of course, I made a very proper fire. But I also found out later, because I asked Rinpoche, after he had given me other teachings, over the subsequent years, I said that teaching about, there's a posture, for example, in the Tumo, the yoga of inner fire. There's one posture in which you're pressing on the tops of the thighs, but there's another posture for sustaining that inner heat, which is called the stove, the three-pointed stove posture. So I said, I think what you gave Rinpoche was the three-pointed stove posture, pointing out, and he laughed. And I said, and then the whole point of that, of course, is that the subtle essences that are released from the crown chakra should not be lost. And so, in a certain sense, he often taught with outer, inner, secret meaning. So to me, that first teaching for that first retreat was very much like that. And then, so that was my first retreat. I stayed for 1 month, and then when I came down back to Kathmandu and saw him, then the first thing he asked me was, "Did you meet the bear?" And I said, "The bear?" And he said, "Yeah, there was a bear living in that cave before you did, but I didn't want to tell you. I thought you might get scared." I said, "Nope." But it did have there was a bit of an animal smell. He said, "No." Anyway, the bear didn't come. So after that, he did ask, my experiences, and yeah, there's a lot that one, could say, but it was, for me, it kind of established very strongly the way that he taught me over the following years, and which was in a way very much based what's called in the Tibetan tradition Nyamtri, which means according. Tri is like explanation or instruction, and Nyam means meditative experience. So rather than following a kind of preset curriculum, which is often the case of the Nundro and as we know, the 100,000 this, 100,000, all of the standard preliminaries, and then the Lama Yidam Khandro, there's a standard formula in Tibetan Buddhism. But Chatral Rinpoche didn't teach me that way. Even when I tried to, I think, I have to do this next. And he would taught according to this Nyamtri tradition, like ask my experiences, check my mind in a way, and then he would advise what was appropriate. It doesn't mean that I didn't have Yidam from him and all of that, but it was always and Khandro, which was Dorje Pomo, and Dorje Drolo. But it was very much a teaching that was based upon pointing out directly the nature of the path. So that was kind of my first real retreat with him. And then every year after that, he would send me, said, "Okay, now go to this cave in another hidden land, in another Bayu." So the next year I went to one called Bayu Kimalung up in the Manaslu Himal area near the Tibetan border, and I stayed there. And there I did the Dzogchen preliminary practices of Korde Rushin, the outer Korde Rushin. So these were traditionally in Dzogchen. These were the entry level. This was the way of entering into the state. So they were originally taught as a separate form of Nundro, and they're kind of wilder than the standard 100,000 prostrations. Instead, you're acting out, as for some people here would know, but just in shorthand, you're acting out through a kind of psychodrama, different potential states of existence, whatever comes into the mind ultimately, but beginning with the 6 states of existence as they're modeled in the Tibetan Wheel of Life. That's the outer level. Then there's an inner Rushin, which works with the chakra system of the body, essentially, and you're clearing out these energetic, karmic obscurations through very basic mantra of Om Ahum, but clearing these centers in the body. And then a year after that, I went to another hidden land, Beil, where he sent me, called, this was actually Pematang in Yomo. And that was for the secret Rushin. And that has a body, speech, and mind component. But all of these are just ways of exhausting the body, the speech, and the mind to enter into the Dzogchen state. And Rinpoche was very clear always about, he said, Dzogchen is not a path. It's an awakening. It's the awakening itself. So whatever it is that brings you there most skillfully is the path, and how the path and the result become ultimately inseparable. So that relates to another teaching that for me was foundational, where after the second long retreat, I went to see him. At that time, he was in Parping above Kathmandu, And I said, well, Rinpoche, and I came back. I was teaching at that time an American university study abroad program in Nepal. And I said, Rinpoche, I don't think, I had to come back. I have to work. I don't think I can be a monk in this lifetime. And he looked at me very funny and said, why would you ever want to be a monk? And I said, well, I guess if I was a monk, I could devote more time to meditation. Said no. And I said, so I should be like a Nakpa, a tantric yogi. Said, nope. And I was like, wow, is he casting me out? Have I no place in this system? I said, well, how should I practice then? What should I do? And he said, you should follow the way of Indrabhuti, who was a Mahasiddha. He said, Indrabhuti he had many things to accomplish in the world. He says, you have many things to accomplish in the world. So Indrabhuti was, he said, a secret yogi and practiced as a secret yogi. And then at the end of his life, attained rainbow body. To everyone's surprise, because people didn't even know he was a practitioner. He goes, so now I will give you the Sangwanal Jorgi Wang, the empowerment of the secret yogi. That's your path. So, it was startling and inspiring and, at the same time, like a koan for me. It's like, well, how do I act like Indrabhuti? I'm not a king. I'm not all the things that one could connect with there. But it related to something else he then told me when I was just spending time with him up at Parping at his, in his room there. And I said, and there are many, many pages, many texts lining the room. And I said, Rinpoche, there's so many texts in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. I said, if I could only read some of them, what would be the most important? So he said, if you can understand them, the only thing you need to read are the dohas, the songs of realization of the Mahasiddhas. And I was like, well, what about all, the Kangjur and the Tengjur, all of the Buddhist teachings and all of the commentaries on that? We know these are these three categories, Kangjur, Tengjur, and Doha. She said, everything is there. When the Mahasiddhas, they were the founders of this, this path, the Siddha path. And he said, if you want to attain enlightenment, stay away from monasteries. He literally said that. And you practice like the Siddhas. And it's like, okay, the Siddhas were kind of wild. They practiced in cremation grounds. And I said, do I have to do that? He says, no, it's not like that. You just go into the mountains and, So it was a beautiful teaching. And I really learned at that time that Chatral Rinpoche had himself practiced and learned and conversed with many great, well, let's say several great, renowned Shakta, Shaiva yogins, particularly Ramnath Agori. And Ramnath Agori was, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. So one of the things that was very profound to me about Chatral Rinpoche was that he was not sectarian, and he was very unorthodox. He told me, for example, if I wanted to attain enlightenment, stay away from monasteries. And I said, continue to do cave retreats, go into the mountains. And this connected very strongly with another teaching that he gave me, which was really after many years, the Dzogchen pointing out instruction, the Tsawong, in which he said, when I asked at the end, I said, well, okay, now, since it's such an absolute view, what is the practice? And he said, the practice is whatever it is that sustains you in this state of mind that I'm showing you right now. He said, literally, whether it's called Buddhism or not. And that was a very profound pointing out, because it also showed and which I also learned then and had heard earlier, that both he and Duzher Rinpoche were very connected to a very powerful Shaiva, Shakta, tantric yogin named Ramnath Agori, who was based around Calcutta. And yep, Ramnath Agori. Yeah, yeah. I'll put it here in the chat. Yeah, so that's Ramnath Agori. And so he was a very powerful, amazing yogin who was from the Kaula tradition. So Chatral Rinpoche was very interested and connected to that. I became very interested in that. So I was living in Kathmandu during these years, many years. And I also went to India to seek out, I wanted to understand what was this link between Kaula, Shakta Tantra, and the Yogini Tantras of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And so Ramnath Agori was no longer there, but I did meet a student of his who also had come to see Chatral Rinpoche and who I first met there, Kulavaduta Satpurananda, who was from that lineage, but was also a Vajrayana Buddhist. So again, a crossover between having started in his life as a yep. And he came while I was there. He came to Parping. And he had been initiated by Ramnath Agori. So he became, it was very, very interesting. So always when I'd come back to see Chatral Rinpoche, he'd want to know what techniques I was learning from, because what I found in the Indian tantric system often, it was less ritualistic, less liturgical, meaning less reciting of texts, and more yogic, involving much more embodied practices. And Chatral Rinpoche said, that's right. So he continued to teach in that way. And I became interested to practice in that way. And during that period, I was also going every year to Tibet from Kathmandu. Chatral Rinpoche would give me different assignments to do. For example, he had told me to, and I'd always ask him, of course, is there anything from Tibet he needed or wanted? And then he'd give these different little tasks. So a whole nother subject, I was going every year for a while to the hidden land of Pemaku in Tibet, and he'd often have me bring back a rock or a piece of bamboo or wood from a specific pass in a particular part of Pemaku. Really interesting assignments that I would do. But on one occasion, he asked me to bring back photographs of the 8 manifestations of Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, from the Potala Palace in Lhasa. So of course I knew photography wasn't allowed there, but somehow I managed, and I could speak Tibetan at that time. I spoke with the kind of caretaker monk. I told him that it had been requested by my teacher, and basically he created a subterfuge, so somehow blocking out the closed circuit TVs, and I got very good photographs of the 8 manifestations of Padmasambhava from the Potala, had them printed out for Chatral Rinpoche. He was very happy with that. And at the same time, I also had made photographs from the Lukang, the Lukang temple that's often, I did a book later on that called The Dalai Lama's Secret Temple. And that was a temple created in the end of the 17th century or early 18th century for the 6th Dalai Lama, who was renowned for not maintaining his monk's vows, but actually living more like a siddha, like as he was described in his blue robes with rings and long hair with a quiver of arrows, was more like a kind of like a rock star, but a poet and a lover. So the sixth Dalai Lama. Yeah, who was, for all intents and purposes, only the second one to be given that name and title. But either he died quite young in his early 20s, or he went on to have a secret life. There's, speculation. There's debate about that. Academics tend to think he died early. It was a very, very critical political period in Tibet at that time. But anyway, he was a great yogi. And the current Dalai Lama, for example, has said that it was very specific that he was a non-monastic, and that actually the Dalai Lama lineage, had he survived, should have gone back to a hereditary lineage like the Sakyas have. He said that would have been a better system for Tibet, because there was too much room for corruption when there would be almost a 20-year period between the death of one Dalai Lama and the time when the next Dalai Lama would attain political maturity. And that led to a lot of problems. Yep. Yep. So this temple, the Lukang, was created at the time of the sixth Dalai Lama, who was born around 1680. And according to kind of historians or academics, was essentially died in his early 20s, so in the first decade of the 1700s, after being deposed. And this led to this was during a very politically challenging time in Lhasa, when the Mongols had a lot of power. But the current Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, who is alive today, told me just in a personal interview that the sixth Dalai Lama, who was notorious for giving up his monk's robes and writing love poems and not behaving the way that he was expected to by the Mongol overlords or by his handlers, the monk handlers. So this Dalai Lama told me that actually he was supposed to father a child who would become the next Dalai Lama. And that was because there was too much room for corruption with the system of having to wait 20 years between the death of a Dalai Lama and 20 years later, when that same Dalai Lama would attain the political power that had otherwise been retained by his regents, those who were acting on his behalf during the period that he was being trained and growing up. So anyway, it's another story, but it still connects to this importance of the non-monastic, non-celibate yogic tradition. And in any case, the temple that was created at that time of the sixth Dalai Lama was full of illustrations on the wall paintings showing the yogic traditions. All of the figures, there's only maybe one or two monks somewhere, but otherwise they are all Mahasiddhas, and they're all Nakpa ascetics, yogis, demonstrating yogic postures of Tsalung Chokor, meaning the inner yogas, as well as Dzogchen practices. So these were considered secret practices. But then the Dalai Lama, current Dalai Lama, when I showed them photographs, he requested me to make a book about them, because he said the time of secrecy is over, it doesn't serve, so please make a book and explain it very thoroughly. So that was a big challenge. I wasn't expecting it, but I had to do that. And I also, of course, saw, when I went back and explained to Chatral Rinpoche what His Holiness had requested, I said, is it okay? Because in a way, Chatral Rinpoche was more traditional. And he said, you might get some trouble from Ekajati. But he said it with a smile. So Ekajati is the protector, the one-eyed protector of the Dzogchen lineage in Tibetan Buddhism. And but in any case, I went back to see His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, and I told him what Chatral Rinpoche had said. And then His Holiness Dalai Lama laughed and said, I think Ekajati will help you. So with that, I continued with that project without undue concern. Yeah, and of course I gave that book when it was finished to Chatral Rinpoche. He was very happy, and he said literally what he told me is, he said, Tibetans should be doing this, but since they're not, it's great that you are. So he was very encouraging of the work that I then, was doing in this regard. And then, but other people, at that time, it was before a lot of these inner practices of Vajrayana became as kind of mainstream as they are now, after COVID, particularly. And some people, there's much more open discussion now about inner tantric practices such as Tumo, yoga of inner fire, the working with the Nadi Prana Bindu, with the Tsalung, Tigle, these kinds of inner practices working with what are generally would be considered completion stage, or Dzogchen practices in Tibetan were kept quite hidden in the past. Certainly when I was first in Nepal, they were not that openly discussed, and now they're very openly talked about. So that's been an interesting change over the last 10, 20 years in how Tibetan Buddhism is presented, I think, in the West. And a lot of teachers now tell me, they said, well, these practices should actually be the nundro. They should be the foundation. And I think they see that because, as they have said, that, unless you have some control. Yeah. The practices of working with the winds, channels, and subtle essences of the body. So working with the subtle body, the Hatha Yoga-like practices in Tibetan Buddhism, which are called, the Tsalung Trulkor, which of course are commonly practiced across the world in yoga studios. And I think with Tibetan Lamas who I've spoken with, they say, well, in the so-called, in the secular Hindu-derived yogic world, all these practices, which are very similar to the secret practices of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, are being taught openly, to anyone, maybe for different reasons, for fitness, for health, for well-being. But the practices themselves are like the foundational practices of the Tsalung. Of course, they go much deeper in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, but they are embodied practices, working with the idea that we're not just, a body of flesh and blood, and we can work with, the subtle energies of the body. And the Dalai Lama himself said this. He said for Westerners, he feels that practicing with deities, the Lagi Naljor, the deity yoga that's more commonly taught in the Western Buddhist world, at least initially, he says that can be very confusing for Westerners because they didn't grow up with thinking about multi-headed, multi-armed, multi-legged deities in Yabgyum form. He said that can be very confusing, he said. But physical practices, he said, beneficial for health and beneficial for spiritual practice. And that's because I had asked him, I said, well, aren't there some of these practices that should be kept secret? But his encouragement, and he wrote a letter that I had to take to some of his own teachers to try to get, full explanation that I did for that book, The Dalai Lama's Secret Temple. So that's just to say that, with Chatral Rinpoche, that he was somehow always very encouraging of this work. And even though it wasn't, I think, typically the way he taught other students, what he was, I'd say, from what I observed from all the years of spending time with him and his family, was he taught people very, very individually, according to their nature, according to their inclination, capacity, whatever it might be. So often when I sought for more so-called conventional practices, he said, no, he would always, in really teaching from a Dzogchen point of view and calling me out, you could say, on grasping after the practices that would otherwise be considered essential, fundamental, but he said that's, not necessary. And that went for a number of different practices that I sought to receive from him. For example, even chud practice, with the drum and thigh bone trumpet. I liked it because it looked very wild and shamanistic. And he literally said, no. He said, chud is for beggars. And I'm like, what? Because I know that it was one that he taught. And when I was up at his retreat centers, and what he meant, that's a bad translation, is for mendicants. He said, if you do chud, fully with the visualization of Tromo Nakmo, the radical black Dakini, who is essentially the Tibetan form of Kali, it's all about dismembering your conventional sense of identity and position in the world. He said, if you do chud well, then it's about cutting through your ego identity, provisional identity. And he said, if you have activities to accomplish in the world, like you do, then chud will undermine them. They'll go wrong. They'll go bad. So he said it's a practice for wandering yogis who have given up worldly activity. So this is where I thought his teachings were always very, very specific to what an individual needed. So even something like chud, which would be considered in general, circumstances very positive, he said it really depends on the individual. So that's, how I experienced him teaching, not only me, but also other people who were also close friends of mine, who he also taught, in some cases similarly, and in other cases, differently, because I think he really worked with people's capacities and inclinations, with their karma, basically. So that's how, he worked with me. And it was, really an amazing experience, because it also, even on an everyday basis, it was like everyday life was like a teaching with him. So I remember in one instance, for example, where it's like 6:30 in the morning or something, and I got a call from his daughter, Semo Saraswati, and she said, Rinpoche wants to come to this land outside of Kathmandu, Nagarjun. So go there now. And then she just hung up the phone. Particular place we're supposed to meet. So sometimes, so I jump out of bed basically and head there. And then there was amazing teaching, because Rinpoche wanted to see this land, which is land that I had been interested in possibly creating a kind of retreat center at. And he decided he would see it, because I had talked with him before about, a stupa, how the stupa would look there, how would it be positioned. But what was amazing is that when we got there, Rinpoche was already quite old in those years. I don't know, must have been well into his 70s at that time, if not older. But literally with two of his attendants on either side, like running through the forest, and just like it was amazing. And then we got to the edge of a kind of a drop off, and we just sat there in this, gazing in the sky. So it was like a teaching but without it being said to be a teaching, of kind of just running, exhausting, and then sitting, gazing the sky. And then there were different. Yeah, it was like that because I had to keep up with him. So he didn't explain like, this is what you need to do, but he'd called in the early morning. I had to show up, and then that's what the training was at that time. It was running, sitting, and then he'd have me literally, as we gazing out into space, he would introduce, then he introduced the practice of just heart-centered awareness. And I felt physically the movement of the energy at the heart center, which and I'd look at him, he'd look at me, acknowledging that I was getting it. So this is how the teaching was. It was not by books, it was by direct experience and direct his present and in his presence and responding to his instructions of, even as I mentioned, even in Tibet, about things he wanted me to bring. And it was about, yeah, it was always like that. And whenever I'd come from overseas to see him again, I knew what foods he liked. You know, he was very fond of bee pollen, and he was very fond of mushrooms, and he was very fond of originally of Chinese elixir wines, but then he stopped that. But these kind of essential foods, kind of very condensed, nutritious foods, he very much appreciated. And yeah, and so it was a great blessing. And I had, a strong connection with his daughters, Tara and Saraswati, as well as with, of course, his Sangyum, now Kamala Rinpoche. So getting to know the family intimately, in all different kind of circumstances was really a blessing, because it was like being brought into a family. And yeah, there are many, many ways that Chatral Rinpoche showed, his extraordinary capacities and yeah, and yeah, even magical capacities, really, I'd have to say. But just in a short way, one time when my house was robbed in Kathmandu, of a lot of money, I went to him and explained what had happened, and to ask for a divination to see how it had happened and whether it was as I suspected. The landlady, anyway, short, to end the whole story, he said, "I'll take care of it." It's like, well, wow, she of course denies it, and da 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 da. In any case, what happened, because I'd already reported her, of course, to the police, because I pretty much knew nobody else could have accessed the house. I came back late at night and came through my front door. The landlords lived on the downstairs, and she, in a gesture that would be common in Nepal for a situation like this, touched my feet and said, "Come inside to the parlor," which I did. And she said, "What would you do if you found out that you were wrong, that the money that you reported to the police was never taken, and it was still at the house?" I said, "Well, of course, I'd go to the police and retract my statement and say that um, mhm, mhm. Should I continue? Oh, okay. Sure, sure. You just tell me when. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So I mention all that because in any case, so she said, just wait a minute. And then she came with her apron filled with all the money that she'd taken, and gave it all back. But the strange thing was that she didn't need to do that. The police had already searched the house, and so I said, where was it? They searched your house. And she said, well, I hid it behind the water heater. Anyway, I didn't ask why her mind had turned, but this was exactly what Chatral Rinpoche had said he would do. And it was a sirka ritual for altering her mindset. And so, of course, I went back the next day and made a big offering to Chatral Rinpoche for the releasing of fish. And he acknowledged that what had happened, what he said he would do, happened. He said, but if it happens again, don't ask me. So it was, for me, why I even mentioned the story is because, it was a mundane, not a dharmic thing, but it was clearly, in my mind, showed that he had some kind of power over circumstances, over the elements, and could alter the outcome of existential situations. And so that was just one very dramatic example for me. But, there were other smaller examples, very much experienced him as having a kind of clairvoyance. He'd ask me about another teacher who he could have had no way of knowing I had just seen, and asking me, for example, how was Tinley Norval? I was like, okay. That was up, after I'd gone up into the mountains to see him. So there was a lot like that where he would playfully reveal, I felt, his clairvoyant, telepathic capacities. I felt he really, saw my mind more clearly than I saw it myself. And the way that he taught was in a way that no one else could have taught. And why, he appeared in my dreams. He appeared in so many ways. I had other great teachings from other great Tibetan Buddhist masters like Dingwa Khyentse Rinpoche, Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, had many teachings and personal relations with them all. But interestingly, they all knew that I was Chatral Rinpoche's student, and so they always deferred. And so I had I don't know, what the karma was, but it was, for me, a great blessing, because I think no other teacher, could have reached me in the way that he did. And so many aspects of my activities were very much based on his encouragement, for example, which is a whole nother subject, but the 10 expeditions that I made into a hidden land of Pemaku in Tibet, which until I went in had been pretty much sealed away from Western visitors, pilgrims, a very wild area. And I wrote a book about it called The Heart of the World, A Journey to Tibet's Lost Paradise. And on each of those expeditions, I always got Chatral Rinpoche's blessings and particular advice and particular assignments. So in a certain sense, all of those trips were sadhanas. They were spiritual practices in their own right, because he gave very specific ways in which, how does one make pilgrimage the path? How does that become the practice? And particularly when it's like as it was often in Pemako, life and death situations. And that's what made those journeys so intense. But somehow or other, it was his blessings, I'd say, were very foundational, central to the fact that I did survive all those journeys. And I think he was very pleased with it, because he knew himself how difficult Pemaku was. One of Dudjom Rinpoche, for example, Dudjom Jigdro Yeshe Dorji, who I took refuge with, who had been born in Pemaku in 1904, had then brought the whole Dudjom Lingpas. He was a reincarnation of Dudjom Lingpa, who was born in 1835 in a very wild part of eastern Tibet, Golok, and then traveled to, had the intention all his life to travel to Pemaku, but never managed. But many of his students went there, and it's actually where his reincarnation was discovered in 1907, when he was already 3 years old. So the connection with Chatral Rinpoche, with Pemaku, that became very central to, and continues to be very central to the work I still do today. Yeah, feels like it's all tied together, and still maintain connections with Kamala Rinpoche, who I had the great surprise fortune to meet when I was boarding a plane recently in Bagdogra, India, and then there she was just behind me in the line. So it's a great blessing to have that connection with the family, and so yeah. So I'm happy to take any questions that anyone may have, or if there are any questions that you had in mind that I didn't address yet, I'd be very happy to respond to them.
Здесь есть вопросы, люди в группе пишут, но давайте сперва зададим вопросы, которые мы запланировали. У меня такой вопрос, а с чем связано такое большое количество вот этих 10 раз поездок в Пемако? Что именно там Иэн пытался найти или что он там исследовал?
It's a question from you, Julia. It's about your journeys to Pemako. You 10 times you traveled to Pemako. So what was the main purpose, and why you traveled there, and what you discovered there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Yeah, Pemako, when I first heard about it, was a place, because of this great interest I had in the Beil, in the hidden lands, that dated back to when I first came to Nepal and first learned about the Thangka painting and learned about these magical kind of places in the physical landscape that were very difficult to reach. That was very appealing to me, because my interest, especially when I was only 19, was the wilderness, and the more difficult the place was, the more attractive it was for me. And so Pemako was considered the greatest of these hidden lands. It was also the place where my own root guru, who I took refuge with, Dudjom Lingpa, had been born. And so there was a really strong karmic connection to it. And Chatral Rinpoche, who over time, because I kept going back, he made a whole list. I don't have that paper anymore. I wish I did. But he wrote out all of the names of the Beil that I should try to go to and practice at. And so, of course, Pemako was top of the list, but when he first made that list, Pemako was impossible to go. So over time, I went back, and 7 times on the Tibet side, and then 3 times on the Northeast Indian Arunachal Pradesh side. Well, it was not there. One could not get a permit to go there from in Tibet or on the India side. So Pemako is described as the earthly body of Vajravarahi, Dorje Pamo, is the Dakini form, the goddess form. And so the whole landscape is described as her body. So her central channel is the Tsangpo River as it flows through Pemako. the two mountains of Kawakarpo and Namchi Barwa are described as her breasts. Her crown chakra is another mountain, Gyalapelri. So when the pilgrim travels through Pemaku, you're traveling figuratively through the subtle body of this tantric meditational goddess form. And so it's a very inspiring, and also the text describe very clearly, as does the oral tradition, that whatever it is one holds in one's mind and thinks, then that's reflected back within by the landscape. And I found that to be overwhelmingly true. So the whole place was like a magic realm for me. And that was why I kept going back every year, because I felt this is a non-ordinary landscape. It was like a shamanistic landscape where the landscape reflects your own thoughts and your own awareness. And so it was very powerful. And so I kept going back. Chatral Rinpoche was always very happy that I would keep going back. However, the very first time I went, he kept me with him for several hours and gave me a black blessing cord, because actually quite recently, before I went that first time, one of his students, who was the wife of Tenzing Norgay, was the Sherpa who climbed Mount Everest for the first time with Sir Edmund Hillary, had subsequently gone on a pilgrimage to Pemaku, and she had died there. And it was believed that she died there because, the wife of Tenzing Norgay. Tenzing Norgay was a Sherpa. Well, actually, he was Tibetan, in fact, but he was the one who summited Mount Everest for the first time that the mountain was climbed, with the New Zealand climber, Sir Edmund Hillary. But his wife was the wife of Tenzing Norgay, and I can't remember her name right now. She was a very devout follower of Chatral Rinpoche. And so Chatral Rinpoche had done the cremation ceremony for her after she died, shortly after returning from Pemaku, where she became very, very ill. And it was, some people said it was because she'd been poisoned there, because there's a poisoning cult connected to Pemaku, which is, I describe in the book. It's obviously not a Buddhist tradition, but it connected to the indigenous traditions there. And so it was something Chatral Rinpoche, as I said, had gave a very, very powerful blessing cord to protect from anything going wrong. So, yeah, and then later, also the lower Pemaku. So the lower part of Pemaku, at the border, you could say, between Tibet and India, is the waste, essentially becomes the waste of Dorje Pomo, Vajavarahi. And so the area below her waist, meaning her womb area in particular, is considered to be the innermost part of the hidden land, Yangsang Pemaku, and very powerful and potent. Yep, Yangsang, I'll write it. Yangsang Pemaku. So Pemaku means in Tibetan, Pema is lotus, and Ku is like array or display, lotus display. Yang Sang. Sang means hidden or secret, and Yang means doubly hidden. So it's kind of the ultra secret Pemaku. It also connects to the ultra secret chakra. So it's essentially the genital chakra below the navel in that part of Pemaku on the Indian side. So it's, again, very, very different from the northern, but now one can actually go to the lower part into Yangsang Pemaku. Not actually, the Yangsang Pemaku is still hidden, but that's where the entry gates would be to the innermost secret part of that Bayu. Whereas the upper part of Pamako is now very closed off by the Chinese because of its, for many reasons, but partly because of an intention they had to build a very powerful hydroelectric water dam in that area, which probably could never happen, but it would have destroyed the area.
Yeah. By the way, sorry, I have a question about this upper Pimlico, this closed these days by Chinese. Is it really dangerous? Is it? As I heard, they already started this dam construction, or?
Yeah, I've seen different. I mean, it's been over many years where they've talked about starting it. I don't know. I mean, if they've actually started the dam construction, then I haven't seen.
As I've read, it was announced like last year in the summer. It was already just beginning of construction, but hopefully maybe by summer.
I'll check on that actually, because otherwise it had been threatened but never acted upon. But if they do build that dam, it would be very devastating to the ecology, it would be terrible, really. So, but of course, from Chinese point of view, they don't really care about it being a sacred realm.
It must be declared as UNESCO heritage, for example. It's something like this, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, I'll look into that right away. It's really important, actually. Because over many years, even from the time when I wrote that book, The Heart of the World, which is many years ago now, it had already was a threat, but it had never been acted on. So if it's been acted upon now, it's terrible. So, we'll see. I see a question above there, actually, did I ever go to Tsari in Tibet? So Tsari is another neighboring sacred area to the west of Pemaku, also on the border with the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. And Tsari is also sacred to Dorji Pamo, Vajavarahi. And but there I tried many times to get the permit, but never allowed. And it's understandable from Chinese point of view because it literally is on the border. The Takpa Shelri, which is the peak at the center of that mandala of Tsari, is literally on the border with India. So but there's a pilgrimage route that goes around it, and I haven't been able to go.
Юля, something. Хочешь что-то спросить?
У меня еще такой вопрос. А правильно мы понимаем, что каждая земля связана, или каждая вот пещера, в которую отправлял Чатрал Ринпоче Иэна, она связана с определенными практиками? Можно что-то вот это осветить? Я помню, что в книге Чатрала Ринпоче «Сострадание в действии», да, вот эта, которая у нас переведена, есть такое, что, например, долина Йилмо, там лучше выполнять всего практики, связанные с рушенами, чодом, симдзинами, как бы подготовительные практики больше для дзакчен.
The question is about particular caves in Yolmo, in general, maybe different BUs. Is there any connection with certain, I don't know, Yidam or certain practices, certain very specific practices? So you spend retreats in different caves, so maybe each cave was connected to very specific Yidam or practices or whatever. Can you say?
Yeah, so the different caves, which were in different Beul and different hidden lands that I practiced at, they were connected with different practices. In particular, in the beginning with the Korde Rushin. I'll type that out for anyone who is not familiar with it. So the Korde Rushin means literally the distinguishing the states. It's about distinguishing samsara, or you could say mundane existence, from enlightened existence, if you will. korwa. It's so it's this different states that we can experience in that spectrum, from the ultimate liberated state of nirvana to the conflicted states of samsara. So it's about recognizing, first of all, how to flip from one to the other. So even when circumstances are very challenging, not to be conditioned by them. So that's the main thing. And so I did 3 different retreats on the outer, inner, and secret Rushen, Korde Rushen. And then I also did a retreat on the Doji Pommel herself, according to the Sarakandro lineage that Chatral Rinpoche held. And he told me it's very, because of Dorji Pommel's connection to Pemaku, I very much felt drawn to do that practice. And so he taught that in a just one-to-one to me very powerfully, about the signs of, how to know when you've accomplished the practice, as it were. And in the Sarakandra tradition, it was a very near transmission because of his connection to this female teacher in Tibet in the early 1900s, who he had great fortune to meet and practice with and receive initiation from. So, and then Dorje Drolo, which of course was another, is a wrathful form of Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche, and also very connected to the hidden lands generally, and Pemaku in particular. So those were practices that I did. But the question had come earlier, is what were his final teachings? So always in the end, he was always emphasizing of just resting in the nature of the mind in any circumstance, uncontrivedly. And I said, well, what about Tugel? The Tugel practices, which we know. He said, if the visions come spontaneously, then that's fine. But otherwise, no need to specifically cultivate the so-called 4 visions of Tugel. But that was just to me personally. He might have taught others differently. But in that context, he also did teach the threefold sky practice, which is a very kind of iconic Dzogchen practice, where you recognize the ultimate unrestricted nature of the mind as it's expressed as a outer, inner, and secret sky, so that the interior of one's whole being is as limitless and expansive as the sky appears externally when you gaze at the sky. So that was how it was for me with him. But then, interesting, the last teachings I received from him, the last time I had the opportunity to meet, I said, Rinpoche, if we don't have the chance to meet again, how should I continue my practice? What's most important? What do you see that would be most beneficial? And of course, he could have said something very different to anyone else, but he said, no, you just remain, it's Rigpa, remain in mind nature. And if that wavers, if you fall from the view, then you practice Tsalung. So Tsalung directly translates as Qigong. It's working with the subtle energy flows within the body. And his view that working with Tsalung, which is Tsalung Tumo, of course, is a practice of Tsalung, and it's a way of amplifying the recognition of that unconditioned nature of awareness. So the kind of the perfect awareness that, as Rinpoche always said, is not a path, it's a state. And it's not even a state, it's a quality of being that any practice, if it's the right one, can, if you've discerned, if you've recognized that state, if it's been pointed out by the teacher, or if they acknowledge it when they ask you the questions to present your understanding of it, then they present the relative practices that would be most beneficial for reinforcing. Yeah. So Chatral Rinpoche's kind of core teaching to me at the end was a kind of pure Dzogchen, pointing out, which he said he'd already given, and therefore Dzogchen it's like the first teaching he gave me about the egg. It's perfect in itself. So the way he taught it to me at the very end was, it doesn't need anything else. It doesn't need the handles. But he said, if you feel that you're not in the zone, as it were, if you're not in that pure non-dual state, then practice tsalung. So he taught, and he said, you can practice tsalung from, he held the Longchen Nintik, the Dujum Tersar, Sarakandro. And he actually, at that time, it was one of the last meetings, he had recently had the whole collected Sumbum teachings of Sarakandro printed. So he gave what's called a pewong, meaning a wong, an empowerment based on text, and he held that on my head for quite a while, recited the prayer, and then said, okay, and then gave it to me and said, you can practice anything in this collected works, the volumes of Sarakandro. And so that was kind of the parting teaching, because I didn't have the opportunity to meet again after that. But it was essentially just, this profound and boundless generosity to give me or to share with me what I feel are the most precious teachings in the Tibetan tradition. And of course, it's all Dzogchen infused in all of those lineages, but all of those lineages, of course, have multiple Tsalung teachings. They also have the three roots of Lama Yidam Khandro, Guru Deva Dakini practices, many, many different relative sadhanas connected to Dakini practice, connected to protector practice, all of that. But for whatever reason, with Chatral Rinpoche, with me, never, ever suggested to do any protector practice, never proposed, even I had to kind of beg for the yidam. He said, our own nature is the rising consciousness is the yidam. And he emphasized that so strongly, when I kind of asked so much for the Doji Pamo transmission because of Pemaku. And he said, it's already your nature. Everything you think you'll accomplish with mantra is already your fundamental nature. And even though when he was giving, just another example of his qualities, when he gave that teaching to me, that gave me the transmission of the Sarakandro Dorje Palmo, just one-on-one, just sitting in his little room up at Parping, he said, then he spoke in the beginning how often empowerments can be very elaborate, often with, all kinds of rituals. But if you think this empowerment would be more powerful if I hit you on the head with a bell and a vajra and poured water on your head, then you're not my student. And he often taught that way. Just, kind of in a radical way to cut through the attachment that I might have or any student might have to the specifics of a particular deity. I'll mention one other very powerful, I felt, teaching he gave to me when I was doing one of my several retreats up in the hidden land of Yolmo. So when I went, I think I mentioned this area called Pematang, meaning the lotus fields, and a very powerful valley in the upper kind of glacial cirque in Upper Yomo.
Мгм.
And, there's naiks, there's the Tibetan descriptions of these sacred places.
Мгм.
Padmasambhava was meant to have stayed, a lot in this Pematang area, the inner part of Bail Yomo. So literally, as I was just going out from his getting the final kind of instructions and blessings, I asked Chatral Rinpoche, I said, so did Guru Rinpoche really stay in the cave that you're sending me to? And he looked at me like, you've understood nothing I've ever taught you. And he said, literally, he always, as I say, taught kind of in 3 steps. He said, where didn't Guru Rinpoche stay? So I had to reflect on that for a moment. He goes, then the next statement was, I think the only place Guru Rinpoche never went was America. But what he's saying is he hasn't penetrated this American heart yet. And then the third thing he said was, find Guru Rinpoche here, and he, tapped his chest, or you'll never find him anywhere. Now go, come back in a month. So that was kind of the parting teaching, was not to be literal about the understanding of how the tradition presents itself, how the deities and founding figures are described. Often when I would ask for those kind of literal, it was like, you're not recognizing that these are not about literal, they're teachings, these stories. They're not factual histories. And he was very powerful in being able to always point out that quality. So that's kind of how I've always felt about it, is that, the magic realism that Vajrayana Buddhism is, and if we take it too literally, then we've actually already missed the key point. And the point is not to dismiss the magic realism, but to actually engage it in a way as if it was real. And by engaging it that way, the power of the narratives infect us. And so, yeah, that was another example of him teaching that way, in the kind of the step by step, and then making one realize something very fundamental and powerful.
Just another question. We know that Kamala Rinpoche, Samyum, Chatral Rinpoche Samyum, she's a daughter of great Terton, Tulshuk Rinpa. Did Chatral Rinpoche say something about him, about his attempt to open this also secret gate to another BU in Sikkim, in Kachijanga?
Yeah. So Tulshuk Rinpoche, Tulshuk Lingpa, who was Kamala Rinpoche's father, was a great Terton, a treasure revealer, as his name Lingpa would infer. But he had this vision, to open a Beu on the slopes of Kanchenjunga, on the border between Nepal and Sikkim. And an amazing story about how everything that he did to try to make that happen. He tried to do it from Sikkim side, but there's so many people were all ready to sell all their homes and their cattle. And then the king of Sikkim, the Chogyal, got very nervous, because he felt like the whole population is going to disappear into a Beu, and what's going to happen. So he basically forbid him from starting from Tashiding. This is what Kamala Rinpoche told me. And therefore he had to cross over a pass into northeastern Nepal. And that's where they made their final attempt, was up over, a snow wall. And then, of course, there was, not of course, but what happened, as I'm sure you all know, there was an avalanche, and Tulshuk Lingpa and several others were all swept away. Some lost, from frostbite, survived, but Tulshuk Lingpa himself didn't survive, passed away. I think Kamala Rinpoche was 18 years old, if I recall properly, at that time. And basically, Chatral Rinpoche was yeah, given the role, as it were, to take care of her. And so, what such a powerful, Chatral Rinpoche had talked about that, Choshik Lingpa's journey, and, in very positive, encouraging ways. But he himself, hadn't, I forget the details of that, but I don't think of course, Choshik Lingpa and Chatral Rinpoche knew each other, they consulted with each other. But Chatral Rinpoche told me, I said, did you ever think to go? He said, no, not at that time. He had other work, in a sense, to do already by that time, and that work continued to be, actually, but maintaining that link with Choshik Lingpa by marrying Kamala Rinpoche. So that, yeah, and then the two daughters from that marriage of Tara and Saraswati.
Great, great, thank you. A little bit about Chatral Rinpoche's life in Tibet before he came to India. So, and about this very dramatic moment, because he was connected somehow to Ritin Rinpoche. He was kind of tutor.
Yep.
Yeah. So what happened there? It's I heard about this.
Yeah, so that happened at a period when Ritin Rinpoche was trying to recall all the details of it, but when Chatral Rinpoche spoke about that time, there was, as we know, there were some dark shadows within the Gelugpa government, the Gan Pochang system, and they killed him, and he was stuffed a kata scarf, ceremonial scarf, shoved down his throat and choked. And this was incredibly disheartening. And this is why Chatral Rinpoche had sort of a grudge against the Gelugpa tradition.
Yeah.
Because I remember even when I was at a certain point in my life, when I was based in Kathmandu, was going regularly twice a year, taking student groups to see His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Yeah, there was an incident about, Shukden, a practitioner, who tried to also, kill Chatral Rinpoche. But in this case, it was the death of Chatral Rinpoche's student in Tibet. I don't have the details exactly, but I remember Chatral Rinpoche talking about that. He said, because I remember even talking about the Dalai Lama, and he was sort of amused that I would go there. And I said, yeah, the Dalai Lama's spreading seeds of Dharma in the West. He goes, yeah, I'll stay here and ripen fruits. So it was kind of an interesting metaphor that he used about, the different emphasis.
As I heard, Chatral Rinpoche personally never met. He refused to meet Dalai Lama in person, right?
Exactly. He said in that lineage, when they started murdering my students, then I don't want to, I don't have any interest to meet. So he had no interest to meet Dalai Lama. There was a period when, like Dingo Khyentse Rinpoche and others were going back to Tibet when that was possible during the 80s, I think it was. And I asked Chatral Rinpoche once, do you have any thought to go back to visit Nyarong, which is the valley in Kham in eastern Tibet where he's from? He goes, So all my relatives there they slaughter yaks and eat yak meat, and I'm a vegetarian, so nobody would feel comfortable.
Yeah, but it seems during his Tibetan life he used to eat meat a lot.
Oh, absolutely. He did. He ate meat. He was very, during his time in Tibet, they're interesting. Kamala Rinpoche confirmed for me, which is something I'd heard before. It was, I think, 2010, when Chatral Rinpoche had another daughter in Tibet before Semo Saraswati or Tara. And it was interestingly, it was a Gelugpa nun who he had an affair with in Kongpo. And she became pregnant and had a child. But Chatral Rinpoche had apparently written a very beautiful poem for her, and he left that for her. And then he had to move on. And then the tides of history came upon, and he, escaped from Tibet and Bhutan, etc., and from Bhutan to Nepal. But apparently, Kamala Rinpoche confirmed this and said that they got a phone call from the parents, I believe, of the Dujim Yangtze in Tibet, who said, there's a woman here who said she's Chatral Rinpoche's child, and she'd like to come to Nepal to meet him. Is it possible? And apparently Chatral Rinpoche said, yeah, it's possible. So yeah, she can come. So then she came, and she stayed, it seems, only for 1 or 2 months. And what Kamal Rinpoche told me is that Rinpoche had said, encouraged her to stay and to assist, Semo Saraswati with the work that she was doing with the archives. But she had said that she had to go back to Tibet. She had family there, so she didn't stay longer. But it's an interesting story, I think, just because it really does show, for what we know about Chatral Rinpoche's life in Tibet. He had this very strong connection, with the non-monastic, wandering, free roving yogi. So Adzam Drukpa, he stayed a lot in Adzamgar, which was a very famous sort of Nakmang, a center for non-monastic yogis to practice and study. He also had a lot of connection with Sarakandro at different periods. Songtral Rinpoche. There are a couple other, key figures in Eastern Tibet at that time who were also kind of the wandering yogi style, not connected to any institutional monastery. And and he went to many, many sacred sites. I don't think I ever asked specifically whether he'd gone to Tsari. He didn't go to Pemaku for whatever reason. But he was very connected to and felt very strongly about the power places of Nechen, the great power places. And that's why, of course, he focused on Ne Yomo, or Beil Yomo in Nepal side, and also, sent me to other Beils in Nepal, like Kimalong and Kembojong. So, so I think his life in that time in Lhasa have been very, very complex, because he was invited there to come as one of the greatest Dzogchen masters, and it could have been such a positive thing, because as we know, even the 5th Dalai Lama had been a secret Dzogchen practitioner. And but as Chatral Rinpoche said, when they started murdering my students within the Gelugpa tradition, he wasn't interested. So that's why he didn't want to meet with the Dalai Lama, because he felt there was some real broken samaya that way. And I think connected to that, there was that other question. About his passing away. I know that I think you'd asked that question earlier. And obviously, we know how central reincarnation Tulku is, the Tulku tradition is in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. But interestingly, Chatral Rinpoche had never been recognized as a Tulku. He never sought to be recognized as a Tulku. And according, to the letter that Saraswati published after his death, he said, "Don't look for my Tulku, there won't be one." So of course that's been very troubling to many people, because they said, well, how? He took the bodhisattva vow. You take a bodhisattva vow, you will be born and born again until all samsara is emptied. How could Rinpoche say he won't come back and in that capacity? So I think that remains a bit of he didn't say that the tradition isn't genuine. Obviously, he spent a lot of time helping to train the Dujim Yangtze, who also passed away very prematurely in Tibet in 2022. And but who also, there's a second Dujam Yangtze in Bhutan. So there's not really scope for another one to be born yet. But it's a mystery with Chatral Rinpoche. And there have been different candidates that have been put forward, and Saraswati has very vigorously put down those people making claims that that they've discovered Chatral Rinpoche's Choku. So I don't know. I think, even when a Choku does arise, they can often be so completely different than their previous incarnation that it's very hard to necessarily see them as one and the same. For example, even Dujam Digdro Yeshe Dorji, born in 1904, completely opposite from Dujam Lingpa, who was born in 1835 and was like a wild shamanic yogi, completely wild. And so apparently had it been said, I've heard that some of his students of Dujam Lingpa had said, when you come back, do you think you could be a little more peaceful than you are now? And he said, yes, but don't complain if I'm too peaceful. So, and of course, Dujam Rinpoche was very mild-mannered and incredible scholar and very gentle, beautiful being, but, didn't manifest the way Dujam Lingpa had, which was almost more like a kind of shaman, very wild, with his sword always, not just a purba, but also a sword, and wild, going from one place to another. So this is a mystery, how, one Tuku can be so different. And just like Dujam Yangtze was, well, of course I would see him when he was very young, when he was there with Chatral Rinpoche in Nepal. But, he wasn't the same. Well, he was and he wasn't the same person that I had taken refuge with. So, and my connection with Chatral Rinpoche was what mattered. So I didn't pursue an independent connection with him. But there were others, who did, like Chris Monson. That was another question that had come earlier, other Western students around Chatral Rinpoche. So Chris Monson was a student of mine. She came on a program that I was running in Nepal originally, Christina Monson, and introduced her to Chatral Rinpoche, and she became a really very, very close student of his, and also a great Tibetan translator. She also became a translator for the Dujam Yangtze, and she also translated, the collected works and autobiography of Sarah Kondro, and very sadly, passed away about 3 years ago from cancer, very prematurely. So that was very sad. And then other people, who other Chatral Rinpoche didn't have, I think, as many people know, very many Western students. People would come to see him, but people, he didn't really accept many as students. So somebody who I was very close with, because we went to Pemaku, almost all the expeditions to Pemaku, I went with my friend Hamid Sadar, who was also very close with Chatral Rinpoche, and so often would see Chatral Rinpoche together. Obviously, Hamid had his own independent connection with him, and he also had a very independent connection with Kamala Rinpoche. He invited her, I guess it was last year, to a camp in northern Mongolia that he has, and so Kamala Rinpoche went with him there to the Hofskol area up near the Siberian border in Mongolia, and she also visited him at his parents' home outside of Paris a few years before that. So those were also, people who had perspectives on Chatral Rinpoche that may differ from what we commonly see sometimes in published writings. And then the other person I should really, which I haven't mentioned, but who was critical, was, although I met Chatral Rinpoche first through the Sakya Dorje, who was actually a Canadian translator, but then later that fall, so like maybe 2 months later, I met Yeshe Dorje, who I think is someone you'll be maybe speaking with. So Yeshe Dorje is an American, originally Bill Wernick, who had been very close with Chatral Rinpoche and done his 3-year retreat, had finished that before I got to Nepal in 1977. And then there were periods then that Yeshe Dorje stayed up in Yomo, and he had a retreat house in Parping, which I would then use often when I was based and living in Kathmandu. So Yeshe Dorje was extremely kind and helpful, translating for me in the beginning with Chatral Rinpoche before, but otherwise Saraswati was the one who translated for me, as well as there are a couple others as well. But Yeshe Dorje had been with Rinpoche for a very, very long time, and yeah. But those were the only, and then there was another one, Nick Cernan, who was an English yogi who had spent a year retreat up in Yomo, but I think has subsequently disappeared. So I don't know, but it was another. So yeah, so the ones that Chatral Rinpoche taught, who were Western, were quite very specific, and because Rinpoche was such a unique kind of teacher.
Yeah, really great. Thank you. So, Julia?
Я думаю, что надо уже заканчивать. Прошло 2 часа, люди устали.
Actually, it's great. We can continue. It's really.
Ярик, я хочу сказать. Я хочу поблагодарить Иэна, потому что мы хотели услышать истории, а получили учение очень глубокое, и, наверное, еще много раз мы будем смотреть эту лекцию, да, это событие, потому что, Чатрал Ринпоче для нас открылся совершенно с другой стороны.
Yeah, just Julia said that we just expected to ask some questions, but we got some real teachings. It's a very unique, profound teaching. So it's with Chatral Rinpoche appeared absolutely different way. It's amazing. It's really, really precious. So great thanks.
Yeah, well, I'm really grateful to have had this opportunity to, present Chatral Rinpoche as I experienced him, because I know that a lot of what one reads in other contexts is, it's not as intimate, and so I felt like this is an opportunity to share more of that kind of side of him. And, he was so unusual that way. Like, just another last example was Shivaratri, which is the celebration once a year of Shiva. So one time Chatral Rinpoche, well, let's go to Pashupati, which is the center in Kathmandu for all the sadhus come. So Christina Monson, myself, just us, and Chatral Rinpoche wanted to go there. So then all of these kind of the bhajans are playing, it's beautiful, to hear the bhajans. And anyway, Chatral Rinpoche went right up on stage and started dancing with the sadhus.
Wow.
And you never hear that story anywhere. But he was so amazingly skillful in his, all his retreat centers always had a small Shiva shrine, and as you know, the main one up at Parping had paintings of Hindu deities and Shiva on the walls. And another friend of mine who had been a long time, this goes back a long time ago, was a student of Harikan Baba, one of the great Shakti Shiva Babas in North India, had been told by Harikan Baba to go and meet Chatral Rinpoche. This is when he was still living in a Joy bungalow outside of Darjeeling. So he went up, he was, dressed like a sadhu. He was Canadian, but he was still dressed in very much sadhu style, and sat there for a couple of days. And then Chatral Rinpoche asked, who are you? And he said, I'm a Shiva Baba. And Chatral Rinpoche said, we're all Shiva Babas here. That was it. And that was his acknowledgement of him. And I'm not sure what else happened after that, but that was how Chatral Rinpoche welcomed him. And so I think all of that is really crucial to who he is, that he was really a Siddha tradition. And as we know, the Mahasiddhas, including like Saraha, who's considered the greatest of them, we have texts in the Hindu tradition that Saraha is giving, how to become Shiva. And we've seen actually literally how the Tibetan translations misconstrue the words and say how to become a Buddha, because even Saraha was revered equally as a Mahasiddha in the Kaula tradition as well as in the Buddhist tradition. So the point is there's a Siddha culture. That's the real tantric culture, where the distinctions between even Hinduism and Buddhism are, not as crucial. It's all about the culture of awakening. And the Buddha just simply means to be awake. And Shiva just means Shiva, pure consciousness. So as Chatral Rinpoche would say, he was more interested in what the techniques were, how they could be learned, how I had understood them. And then he'd give his feedback and commentary. So it was a great blessing for me to meet with a great Siddha in this lifetime, and to be, had the great fortune to have him sort of accept me as a student.
So you gave us some of part of this blessing actually transmitted.
Well, again, I think the work you're doing is great, and it's so important, and I'm very happy, of course, to follow up and participate in whatever way is helpful for the ongoing project with Kamala Rinpoche. And I'm very, very grateful to her for having suggested that you reach out and contact me. And I'll send her a WhatsApp message. Just,
So maybe next time we have an opportunity to meet, to continue our talk, but maybe if possible.
Yeah, if that opportunity comes, it'd be amazing, wonderful. So
also, personally, I would like to say great thanks for your book, Heart of the World. I've read this. It's amazing and very inspiring.
Okay,
book.
and do you know the book I also did called Tibetan Yoga, Principles and Practices?
I know. I've seen this. I also have this album of his secret Dalai Lama's temple in Lhasa.
Right.
So it's amazing. So
Yeah.
I know this. So thank you. So.
Yeah, but then the Tibetan Yoga one is the latest one that I did, which is all good. Yeah.
И она переведена на русский, да? Она на русский переведена. Есть у нас.
By the way, this particular book is translated into Russian.
Yeah. Yes, I did hear that actually. I haven't seen the Russian edition yet, but it is translated apparently. Yeah. So that's Alexander Smirnov, I think was. Do you know him?
I'm not personally. I don't know.
I don't know. I heard that he was.
I heard about plan to translate this Heart of the World, but it's also some.
Well, if that happens, that'd be great too.
Maybe one day, maybe.
Yeah. So a lot of work to be done.
Oh, great. So it's time. It's already 2 hours, even more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can continue, but probably.
Well, I know it must be extremely late for you. Extremely late for you.
In my place, it's around 9. In Moscow, probably it's already 10 p.m.
Okay, not too bad. Yeah, I'm in Scotland, and here it's only 8 p.m. So all is good. Anyway, thanks again, and we'll follow up with anything else. Otherwise, again, thank you.
Мы будем счастливы увидеться с вами еще раз. И вот люди нам все там пишут, что все хотят встретиться еще раз.
We are very extremely happy to meet you. Also, and there are so many people also wanted to continue this talk. Maybe next time.
Well, we can see another time, perhaps. We'll see. I'm just realizing now I hadn't even focused. Chatral Rinpoche is here above my shoulder, up on the wall here. On the wall. Anyway, thanks again so much, and I think it's beautiful to see that there's so much interested in Chatral Rinpoche's and Sangyam Rinpoche's life, and what they represent as, I believe, the real core essence of Vajrayana Buddhism outside of the monastic traditions. Very important that gets more recognition over time.
Yeah, it's very actual and important for our time, for our age, our situation. So
very good.
Okay.
I guess I'll sign off and make dinner.
Всё.
Okay.
Да.
Yeah. Good night.
Good night.
Да.